When Ethan Ward lost his job at the steel mill, it felt like his world had collapsed. Rent was late, the cupboards were bare, and three young boys were looking to him for answers he no longer had. So, he packed what was left of their lives into a rusted-out van and drove until the road disappeared into the depths of the snow-covered forest, where the silence settled like dust. There, half hidden under years of neglect, stood an old cabin, forgotten, fragile but still standing. That night, by the flickering light of the fireplace and the groaning of broken beams, Ethan told his sons they were home, at least for now. As the wind whispered through the pines, something quiet began to stir hope. But what no one expected was that the old cabin would rebuild more than just walls. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I have something very special in store for you. The morning after their first night in the cabin dawned with a thin line of pale light slicing through the frosted window. Ethan woke before his sons. The fire had died out, leaving only a faint orange pulse in the ashes. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the ache of the cold seep into his bones. It was the same kind of ache that had lived inside him ever since the factory gates had closed for good. He stepped outside, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The air was so crisp it almost sang, clean, sharp, untouched. A fine mist coated the valley, and the snow glittered in layers like powdered glass. He hadn't seen anything so quiet in years. For a moment, that stillness frightened him. The world felt too big, too empty. The boys were still asleep when he noticed something under the porch step, a small glint, half buried in the frozen earth. He knelt, brushed away the ice, and picked up a rusted iron key. It was old, worn at the edges, and heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his palm, feeling its weight. It didn't belong to anything he knew, but it held a strange comfort, as if it had been waiting there for someone just like him to find it. He slipped it into his coat pocket and whispered, "I guess you're part of the story now." When the boys woke, their breath formed clouds in the air. Ben, the middle child, frowned. "Dad, the fire's out." "I know, buddy," Ethan said softly. "We'll build another. Grab the smallest logs first. Be careful with them. It's all we have for now." The oldest, Noah, already 12, began searching the corners of the cabin. "We need insulation," he said, repeating something he'd heard his father tell once while fixing the old house they used to rent. "Good thinking," Ethan replied. "We'll use what we can find. The old drapes, maybe the rugs." They worked in silence, their breath misting in the cold. Every hammered nail, every placed board of shard became a lesson, not just in building, but in survival. Ethan didn't say much, but his hands spoke for him. Steady, deliberate, teaching through motion. By noon, the cabin had a small fire going again, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. They melted snow for water in a dented pot, shared 2 cans of beans, and huddled together as they ate. The boys didn't complain. Hunger had a way of teaching gratitude faster than words ever could. "Dad?" Ben asked, looking out the broken window frame. "What if no one ever finds us out here?" Ethan paused, then smiled faintly. "Then we'll find ourselves, son. Sometimes that's the harder thing to do in a crowd." Later, while the boys played near the frozen creek behind the cabin, Ethan wandered through the rooms. Just 2 of them, with walls darkened by time and dust as thick as memory. He took the key from his pocket, and turned it in the light that streamed through the cracks. It didn't fit any lock he could see, but it somehow made him feel anchored, as if the cabin itself had chosen him, and not the other way around. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the doorframe, whispering a silent vow. I'm going to make this place breathe again. As dusk settled, the sky turned a deep, bruised blue that looked almost eternal. The boys returned with flushed cheeks and laughter in the air. They brought kindling, pine cones, and an old tin sign they'd found nailed to a tree. Carter's Crossing. I guess that's what this place was called, Noah said, holding it up. Ethan nodded. Carter's Crossing. Sounds like a place worth remembering. That night, as they sat around the fire, Ethan told them a story about a man who built his own home from nothing but fallen branches and faith. He didn't tell them the man was him. Some truths needed time to take root. When the boys finally fell asleep, Ethan stepped outside one more time. Moonlight washed over the clearing, silvering the snow and tracing every broken line of the cabin's roof. He reached into his pocket, feeling the iron key again, cold, solid, certain. He held it up to the light and whispered, "Let's see what you open." In that moment of silence, something shifted. Not in the world, but in him. The fear that had followed him from the city began to recede, replaced by something smaller, quieter, but stronger. A belief that even in ruin, there could be a beginning. The key pressed into his palm, and though he couldn't explain why, Ethan smiled. Maybe it wasn't a key for doors. Maybe it was a key for hearts. By the end of the week, the sky turned a pewter gray, and the wind grew an edge. Ethan had seen enough winters in the valley to know when a storm was coming, the kind that made the mountains disappear behind a wall of white. He spent the morning nailing boards over the largest gaps in the walls, while his sons carried in what little firewood they'd gathered. "Keep stacking it close to the hearth," he told Noah. "If the snow piles up too high, we might not get the door open." Ben looked up, worried. "How long do storms like this last?" "Long enough," Ethan answered, "but not forever." By afternoon, the forest fell silent. No birds, no rustle of wind, just the heavy quiet that nature holds right before it unleashes something fierce. The first flakes fell slowly, almost gently. Then they grew thicker, falling sideways with the wind. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls like an old memory. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, watching the door. The rusted key now hung from a nail above the mantel, reflecting the glow of the flames. It had become part of their small ritual. Every night, before the boys slept, he would touch it, like a promise that tomorrow would still come. As night deepened, the wind began to howl. The roof groaned under the weight of the snow. Ethan stood by the window, watching the drifts climb up the porch steps. The boys huddled near the fire, wrapped in blankets, their faces half lit. "Dad," Noah said quietly, "what if the roof breaks?" "Then we'll fix it," Ethan said. His voice didn't waver, though his hands felt numb. "Same way we fix everything else." Ben, Paus, and Tem and Liam, the youngest, moved closer to him. He put a hand on each of their heads. The cabin groaned again, a sound like settling bones. Ethan took a deep breath and told himself that fear was just another kind of weather. It came, it passed, and what mattered was how you stood in it. The hours crawled by. The fire dwindled. He added another log, then another. He counted the boys' breaths as they drifted into a restless sleep. When he was sure they were resting, he sat at the table by the window, staring out at the storm. The wind shrieked through the cracks, and he thought of all the nights before this one, when they'd had walls that didn't leak and food that didn't need to be rationed. He could still picture his wife Claire standing by the stove, humming softly as snow fell outside. That was before the sickness, before everything changed. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he let himself hear her voice again, soft as the snow tapping against the glass. "Keep them warm, Ethan," she had said once from her hospital bed. "Whatever happens, just keep them warm." The fire crackled, pulling him back. He smiled faintly. "I'm trying, Claire," he whispered. "I'm still trying." Near midnight, the door rattled violently. For a moment, he thought it might give way. He pushed his shoulder against it, holding it fast. The storm fought him, roaring through every gap, but he held his ground until it eased, breath by breath. When he finally let go, he noticed something strange. A small gust had blown snow across the threshold, but under it, faintly visible, was a shape, a print, like the sole of a boot. He frowned, brushing the snow away. It wasn't one of theirs. Too big, too sharp at the heel. Someone had been here before the storm, perhaps watching. The thought sent a chill through him, colder than the wind. He took a step back, his eyes fixed on the key hanging near the fire. It swayed slightly in the draft, the metal glinting. He took it down and held it tight. "You've kept us safe this far," he murmured. "Don't stop now." When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world white and new. The trees bowed under the weight, and the cabin was half buried. The boys stirred, stretching under their blankets. Noah peered out the frosted window. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice full of awe. Ethan smiled, weary but proud. "Isn't it?" He pushed the door open carefully. Snow drifted in, light as feathers. Outside, the world was quiet again, not empty, but alive in its stillness. He looked down at the ground near the porch. The footprint was gone, swallowed by the night's snow as if it had never been there. But he knew what he had seen. Ethan looked at the key in his hand, cold against his palm. It didn't open any lock he had found, but it had become his measure of faith, proof that small things could carry great weight. He put it back in his coat pocket before stepping out into the snow. "Come on, boys," he called out. "Let's clear a path." The world doesn't clear itself. One morning, Ethan was standing on the porch, warming his fingers around a mug of weak coffee. The sun filtered through the trees, soft and gold. He watched his sons gathering kindling for the day's fire and thought, "We're getting there. One nail, one breath at a time." That's when he saw it. A movement among the trees, a flash of color. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was human. He tensed, setting his mug down. The shape grew clearer. A man, wrapped in a dark coat, was walking with a slight limp. He carried something long, maybe a walking stick or a rifle. Ethan stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the damp ground. "Morning," he called out, keeping his voice steady. The man stopped a few yards away, squinting against the light. His face was weathered, etched with lines as deep as old bark. "Didn't expect to see anyone living here," he said, his voice holding the rough-hewn quality of someone accustomed to silence. "We didn't expect to be here either," Ethan replied. "The cabin was empty. Figured we could make use of it." The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the roof, the stacked firewood, the smoke rising from the chimney. Used to be the Carter's place, he said. Family that ran the old sawmill by the creek, before the flood. Ethan had heard that name before. Carter's Crossing, the sign his boys had found. I guess we're just borrowing it then. The man watched him for a moment. Then a small smile touched his lips. Borrowing is better than letting it rot. He moved closer, extending a gloved hand. Name's Harold. I live 2 ridges over. A hunter, mostly. Ethan shook his hand. Ethan Ward. And my boys are Noah, Ben, and Liam. Harold nodded toward the cabin. You fixing her up? Trying to. We've got more will than we do tools. Harold chuckled. That's how most good things get started. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were a few old nails, a used spool of fishing line, and to Ethan's surprise, a brass key, newer than the one Ethan carried, with a small tag that read, Creekside Storage. You'll find a shed down the trail about a half-mile east, Harold said. The old Carter family used to store their tools in there, Harold said. If you're lucky, you might still find something dry. Ethan looked down at the key, then back at Harold. Why are you giving this to me? The old man shrugged. You're trying. That's worth a helping hand. Before Ethan could reply, Harold tipped his hat and turned back toward the woods. The trees swallowed him as silently as they had revealed him. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, his boys sleeping beside him. He placed both keys on the table, the old iron key from under the porch and the brass key Harold had given him. The firelight caught them both, one dull and ancient, the other bright and new. He turned them over in his hands, feeling their differences. One is a relic, the other a promise, he whispered. 2 keys, 2 chances. Then he tucked them safely into his coat. The next morning, they followed Harold's direction. The trail wound through dense pines and across a narrow, half-frozen creek. After half an hour, they found it. A cabin listing to one side, its roof sagging but otherwise intact. Inside, beneath a roof hardened by time, they discovered what felt like treasure. A hammer, a saw, a handful of nails, a coil of rope, and a lantern still full of oil. Ben let out a whoop of joy. Dad, we can fix the roof! Ethan laughed, a deep, genuine sound that felt foreign after so many months of silence. Looks like we can, boys. Looks like we can. They carried what they could back to their own cabin. By afternoon, the sound of hammering echoed through the trees. Wood against wood, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The place that had felt so fragile now felt alive. Not perfect, but determined. That night, after the work was done and the last of the light had faded, Ethan stood on the porch again, holding the 2 keys. He hefted the iron one first. Cold, heavy, a symbol of where they'd begun. Then the brass one. Light, warm, a sign of what might come next. He glanced through the doorway at his sons. Noah was showing Ben how to hammer a nail straight, and Liam was humming to himself by the hearth. Ethan slipped the keys into his pocket and whispered, I don't think we're just surviving anymore. Above the cabin, smoke rose in a thin, steady line, a signal to anyone watching that life had returned to Carter's Crossing. Somewhere deep in the woods, Harold saw the smoke and smiled to himself. Though Ethan didn't know it yet, the 2 keys he now carried would open more than doors in the days to come. The thaw came slowly, a steady drip that melted winter away. The snow receded inch by inch, revealing the damp earth and the scattered bones of last autumn's leaves. By mid-March, the world around the cabin was no longer white, but brown and green once more. The colors of a new beginning. Ethan was up before dawn each day, stoking the fire, coaxing life from the embers. The boys had settled into a routine. Noah fetched water from the creek, Ben split kindling, and 6-year-old Liam gathered pine needles and twigs in a small tin pail. The cabin was far from comfortable, but it was no longer desperate. Every board they nailed, every gap they sealed, brought them a little closer to permanence. Still, food was scarce. The last of the canned goods were gone, and hunting had been lean. Ethan rationed their remaining flour, mixing it with melted snow to make it last. One morning, as he kneaded the sticky dough by the fire, Noah asked, "How long until we can go back to town, Dad?" Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, watching the pale dough rise and fall beneath his fingers. "When we have something to trade," he answered. "We can't just take." "What can we trade?" Ben asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "What we can build." Later that day, he and the boys carried a few handmade things down the trail. A crude wooden bench, a set of small birds Ben had whittled, and a bundle of sturdy firewood tied with twine. The path led them to a dirt road where Harold had said the old post office stood. What they found was a small, half-collapsed shed by the roadside, still in use as a local trading post. A hand-painted sign hung on the side. "Leave something, take something." Ethan placed their offerings on the shelf and looked around. In exchange, he found a loaf of paper-wrapped bread, 3 candles, and a note written in cursive. "For whoever is fixing up the Carter place, welcome back. Every house deserves a heartbeat." Ethan folded the note carefully and put it in the pocket next to the cabin key. He didn't know who wrote it, but the words settled in his chest, a welcome warmth. When they returned, the boys devoured the bread, steam rising from the crust. It was plain, simple, dense, but it tasted like a feast. Liam grinned through the crumbs. "It tastes like town bread," he said, as if that made it a royal delicacy. That night, Ethan tacked the note above the fireplace where the old key hung. There were 2 symbols now, the key and the letter, both reminders that they weren't entirely alone in the world. After dinner, he sat on the porch, watching the forest darken. The last light washed over the valley, touching the trees with a coppery glow. Smoke curled from the chimney, spiraling into the sky, carrying their presence into the quiet air. Somewhere, perhaps, it would be seen again. Harold appeared 2 nights later. He brought a small bag of nails, a tin of coffee grounds, and a smile that reached his tired eyes. "Heard the town's been talking about the Carter place," he said. "Seems the smoke from your chimney has drawn more attention than you think." Ethan chuckled softly. "The good kind, I hope." Harold shrugged. "People notice effort. It's been a long time since anyone tried to bring this valley back to life." He leaned on his walking stick, gazing at the lit windows. "You're doing good work." Ethan nodded, humbled. "Just trying to make it livable." "That's where all miracles begin," Harold said, turning to leave. "With someone trying." As he vanished into the trees, Ethan looked at his own hands. Rough, chapped, but steady. They had once built machines in a factory that roared like thunder. Now they were building shelter, warmth, safety, things that breathed and listened. Inside, the boys had started a small game. Noah and Ben were stacking pieces of firewood like building blocks, while Liam pretended to guard the fort. Their laughter filled the cabin, echoing in the rafters like a song the house had long forgotten. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching them. The flickering firelight reflected off the metal of the cabin key above the hearth, making it gleam. He thought of how far they'd come from that first night, from hunger and fear to this small moment of peace. He reached out and touched the key gently. It was warm from the firelight. "You did good, old friend," he whispered to it. Outside, an owl, Ohibal, hooted from the pines. The valley lay still under the moon, but Ethan no longer felt swallowed by its silence. Instead, it felt as if the land itself was listening, patient, approving. Before turning in, he added a line to the note above the fireplace, using a worn-down pencil he'd found in the shed. "Thank you. The heartbeat is back." Then he returned the key to its place beside the note and banked the fire for the night. In the dim light, he lay awake for a time, listening to the soft breathing of his sons. For the first time in months, the word home felt like something real again. Not just a place, but a shared pulse between them all. And as sleep took him, the wind outside carried the faint scent of smoke and bread. A promise that life, however fragile, had decided to stay. By the end of April, the forest around the cabin stirred with new sounds. Birds calling, water rushing, the low hum of insects returning to life. The boys began to explore beyond the clearing, following the narrow creek that snaked behind the ridge. It was a good sign, Ethan thought. Curiosity meant they were healing. He was splitting wood when Noah came running back from the trees, out of breath. "Dad," he called out. "There's someone down by the creek." Ethan's hand froze mid-swing. "Someone?" "A man," Noah panted. "He has a pack and a shovel. Looked like he was digging." Ethan set down the axe, wiped his hands on his pants, and motioned for Noah to stay close. He picked up their old shotgun, unloaded, but the sight of it was caution enough, and made his way down the slope where the creek glinted through the trees. Sure enough, a figure was kneeling near the bank. He was an older man with a graying beard and a torn jacket sleeve. A small pile of rocks sat beside him, and half buried in the mud was a dented, rusty tin box. Ethan called out in a steady voice, "You lost, friend?" The man looked up, startled. His eyes flickered to the shotgun, then to Ethan's face. "Joe. No trouble," he said, raising a hand slightly. "Just looking for something that belonged to me." "What's in the box?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "Letters," he said, "from before." He wiped the mud from the metal lid, revealing faded initials scratched into it. J.C. Ethan lowered the shotgun slightly. "Carter?" The man nodded slowly. "My name is James Carter. This was my father's land." Ethan felt a chill run up his spine. Carter, the same name carved into the cabin's doorframe. James studied him for a long moment. "Are you the one fixing up the old place?" Ethan nodded. "We're just trying to. Didn't know there was any family still around." "Most aren't," James said. He pried open the tin box with trembling hands. "I left this valley as a boy. My father stayed. Never made it out after the flood." Ethan knelt beside him. "You looking to stay?" James shook his head. "No, just needed to see it one more time, before it's all gone." He glanced up the ridge toward the cabin. "Didn't expect anyone to ever live there again." Ethan's expression softened. We were just looking for shelter. We lost everything last winter. James gave a faint smile. Then maybe the place found you. They talked for a while about the old homestead, the flood that had nearly buried it, and the years James had spent wandering between towns. He spoke in a slow, careful tone, as if the words themselves might break. Ethan listened, feeling the strange weight of shared loss that connected them. Before he left, James pressed something into Ethan's palm. It was a small brass tag, greened with age. Stamped into it were the words, "Property of Carter and Sons Lumber." "My father ran the sawmill here," James said. "That brass key you found in the shed? It probably fits one of the doors down at the yard." Ethan turned the tag over in his hand, feeling the cool metal against his skin. "I'll keep it safe." James nodded once, his eyes wet. "Then I can rest easy." As the old man walked away, his figure faded into the trees, as if the forest had swallowed him back into memory. Ethan stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the creek, the steady dripping of time passing. When he returned to the cabin, the boys gathered around him. "Was he dangerous?" Ben asked. "No," Ethan said softly, placing the brass tag next to the hanging keys. "He was a part of this place, just like we are now." That night, a rain began to fall, first gently, then with a steady resolve. The boys slept soundly, lulled by the rhythm on the roof. Ethan sat by the fire, the keys gleaming faintly in the light, the tag beside them. Two artifacts from two different eras, now sharing the same space. He thought of James, a man searching for pieces of his past, and of himself, trying to build a future from the ruins. Perhaps that was what the valley required, that every soul who entered its silence leave a piece of themselves behind, a memory or a promise. As the wind sighed through the trees, Ethan took the pencil and added a new note below the first one by the hearth. "I met a man who once called this place home. He left something behind, and so will I." The fire burned low. Outside, the storm intensified, washing the valley clean. Before he went to bed, Ethan touched the brass key again, its metal warmed by the heat. It no longer felt like something that unlocked a door. It felt like it unlocked a history. It was as if a door had been left open. As he finally lay down beside his children, listening to their slow, sleeping breaths, Ethan realized the stranger hadn't just come to reclaim a past. He had brought the future with him. The cabin had accepted another layer of history, another ghost softened by memory. The valley, once forgotten, was learning to live again. And within its walls, so was Ethan. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was pale and calm. The next, clouds gathered like bruises over the mountains. Ethan smelled the change before he saw it. That damp, electric tang in the air, just before the heavens opened. He had just finished reinforcing a joint in the roof when the wind rose, lashing the cabin with pine needles and loose snow. Inside, the boys scrambled to secure the windows. "Ben, light the lanterns," Ethan shouted. "Noah, make sure Sophie is safe by the stove." The first clap of thunder was so violent it shook the rafters. The cabin groaned, but held. For a moment, Ethan let out a breath, until he heard a splintering sound, sharp and raw. He turned just in time to see one of the window frames shudder. Water was seeping through a growing gap. He rushed to it, pressing a board against the crack. "Hold that light steady!" he yelled. Ben obeyed, though his hands were trembling. Rain hammered the glass, and outside branches whipped against the walls like claws. Then the wind shifted, and Ethan heard something else, a sound deeper than thunder, a grinding roar. It was the river. The creek that once whispered through the woods was now a monster, swollen and furious. Through the window, he saw the flash of debris tumbling down the slope, roots, logs, and pieces of the old bridge they had crossed weeks before. "Dad!" Noah cried out. "The water's rising fast!" Ethan's chest tightened. If the flood reached the clearing, they would lose everything all over again. He grabbed the key hanging by the door, not quite knowing why, and shoved it in his pocket before running outside. The rain was a cold shock against his face. The clearing was already slick with mud, puddles swelling into small ponds. The creek had breached its banks, cutting off the path they used for firewood. Ethan waded into the water, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He dragged the sandbags they had placed weeks earlier, trying to reinforce the stacked log wall. His arms ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, the lantern light from the cabin glimmered, a golden speck against the gray. Inside were his children, all he had left. A voice cut through the storm. "Dad, take this!" Noah came running, dragging a long wooden plank. Together, they drove it into the mud, trying to redirect the flow. Ben and Sophie were at the window, shouting words of encouragement he could barely hear over the wind. For nearly an hour they fought the water, soaked and shivering, but refusing to give in. And then, slowly, the current began to recede. The makeshift barrier had held. When Ethan finally stumbled back inside, drenched and exhausted, the boys rushed to him. He managed a weak smile, wiping mud from his face. "We're okay," he whispered. "We made it." The fire was nearly out, but he coaxed it back to life with the last of the dry kindling. The warmth spread slowly, painting the room in gold once more. He pulled the key from his pocket, turning it over in his fingers. Ben noticed. "Why'd you bring that out there?" he asked. Ethan stared at it for a moment, before answering. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe because it's a reminder that things don't have to stay broken." They all sat together, the storm still raging outside, but it somehow felt distant now. The boys leaned against him, their heads heavy with sleep. Later that night, when the rain had softened to a whisper, Ethan went out again. The air was clean, full of the scent of wet pine and earth. The moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the flooded valley below. In that soft, silver light, he saw something glinting at the water's edge, half buried in the mud. He knelt and dug it out. It was an old horseshoe, bent and rusted. He wiped it clean and smiled faintly. "A little bit of luck," he murmured. Back inside, he hung it above the door, next to the cabin key. 2 pieces of iron, one for the survival they had endured, the other for the luck they would need to continue. Before he went to bed, he wrote another line in his journal by the firelight. "The storm tried to take us, but maybe storms don't come to destroy. Maybe they come to show us what's still left standing." He set the book down and listened. The cabin creaked softly, as if in reply. Outside, the water was still moving, calmer now, carrying away branches, leaves, and the fears of the day. The forest, wounded but alive, whispered its slow forgiveness. And for the first time since he'd lost his job, Ethan didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man building one. By the end of winter, the forest had fallen quiet again. The storm had left the trees bare and coated the paths in a thick sheet of ice. For weeks, Ethan and his children stayed mostly indoors, their days divided between mending leaks, splitting firewood, and studying by the hearth. One gray afternoon, while the boys were at their lessons, Ethan heard something unusual. The faint crunch of footsteps outside. Not an animal, not the wind, but the measured tread of a person. He pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted between the pines, as soft as a breath. Then he saw him. A figure was moving slowly along the ridge, half stumbling, half dragging something behind him. "Hey, are you all right?" Ethan called out. No answer. The figure swayed and then collapsed into the snow. Ethan ran. His boots sank deep as he reached the stranger. He was a man in his 60s, his face pale and his lips blue with cold. His coat was torn at the sleeve, his pack half open. Ethan felt for a pulse. Faint, but steady. He heaved the man over his shoulders and carried him back to the cabin, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Inside, the boys looked on, alarmed. "Who is he, Dad?" Ben asked. "Someone who needs help," Ethan said. "Get blankets, quick." They bundled the stranger near the fire, rubbing his hands to warm them. Sophie brought a tin of broth, and Noah coaxed the flames higher. It took nearly an hour before the man stirred, his eyes blinking weakly. His voice came out as a rasp. "Didn't mean to trouble you." Ethan offered a small smile. "You're safe. That's all that matters now." The man's name was Walter Grant. He'd been hiking the ridge when the storm hit, searching for the old fire watchtower he used to man in his youth. "Figured I could make the trip one last time," he said with a sheepish grin. "Guess I overestimated these old bones." Ethan chuckled softly. "Happens to the best of us." For the next few days, Walter stayed to regain his strength. In return, he helped where he could, teaching the boys how to tie knots and sharpen tools, and telling stories of the forest in the old days. He spoke of the Carter family, who had first owned the cabin, of the flood that had swept through 30 winters ago, and of how the valleys had slowly emptied of people after that. Noah listened most intently, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you know them?" Walter nodded. "They were good people. Built this place with their own two hands. Your father's done well to keep it standing." That evening, after the boys were in bed, Walter sat with Ethan by the fire. "You have something rare here," he told him. "A home made of nothing but grit and love." Ethan stared into the flames. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough." Walter smiled, the lines on his face deepening. "It never does, until someone reminds you what enough really is." The old man's words stayed with Ethan long after he went to bed. By morning, the snow had softened under a weak sun. Walter packed his bag to leave. The boys stood on the porch, waving. Before he started down the path, Walter reached into his coat and held out a small iron key. "I found this near the riverbank a few days ago," he said. "Must have belonged to the Carters. Feels right that it should stay here now." Ethan turned the key in his hand, surprised. It was almost identical to their own cabin key, only newer, less corroded, its edges still sharp. He placed it beside the original on the nail by the door. "Two keys," Sophie said. "One for them and one for us." Ethan smiled. "Something like that." Walter nodded, his gaze soft. "You're doing good work here, Ethan. Keep building. Not just walls, a life." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the whiteness, his figure fading between the trees, like a memory carried on the wind. That night, The boys gathered close as the fire crackled. Ethan watched the two keys hanging side by side. The older one had survived the storm, the flood, the darkness. The new one gleamed faintly in the firelight, a promise of what was yet to come. He wrote another line in his journal. Sometimes, strangers arrive when your heart has nearly run out of faith, and they leave behind something that keeps it alive. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering his tracks, but not his path forward. And in that small cabin, beneath the hum of the pines and the whisper of the flames, 4 hearts beat steady, no longer just surviving, but beginning to belong. As spring began to whisper through the pines, the snow melted back into the earth, turning the clearing into a patchwork of mud and green shoots. The birds returned, tentative at first, then bold, filling the air with songs the boys hadn't heard since before the move. Ethan stood outside one morning, watching the mist recede from the valley. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace, a fragile but real thing inside his chest. Noah and Ben were arguing good-naturedly over how to fix a loose floorboard, while Sophie hummed as she arranged wildflowers in a cracked jar. The cabin had come alive around them. Every nail, every patched wall, every scuff on the floor held a memory. Ethan smiled, sipped from his tin mug, and went to sit by the hearth. It was then he noticed something tucked deep within the old stone fireplace. At first he thought it was just soot or a piece of bark. But as he reached in, his fingers brushed against something smooth, folded, and brittle with age. He drew it out. It was a yellowed envelope with curled edges, sealed with a faded red wax that had long since cracked. On the front, in a delicate looping script, were the words, "For whoever finds this home." Ethan's heart paused for a beat. He turned the envelope over in his hands. The wax flaked away gently under his thumb. As he opened it, the scent of ash and pine drifted out, the aroma of years. The letter inside was written in a flowing cursive hand. "If you have found this, then this cabin is alive again. We built it in the spring of 1954, when our daughter was born. We laughed here, we cried here, and we weathered winters that nearly took us. But what kept these walls standing wasn't timber. It was love. If the world has brought you here, it means you too have lost something. Do not run from it. Build with it. Let every hammer fall be a prayer, every plank a promise. This place has a heart. Keep it beating." The paper trembled in his hands. He looked at the hearth, picturing the family that had once sat before it, their laughter echoing off these same walls. Ben peered over his shoulder. "What is it, Dad?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A message. From the people who were here before us." Noah leaned closer. "What does it say?" Ethan read the letter aloud. The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hush, as if it were listening. When he finished, Sophie whispered, "They sound like us." Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe they were. He carefully folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. Then, he looked at the nail beside the door, where the two keys hung. Without a word, he slipped the envelope onto the same nail, resting it just behind the keys. 3 generations of survival were now joined. The Carters, this new family, and the silent thread that bound them. That afternoon, the boys worked harder than ever. They built a small wooden box to hold their keepsakes, the letter, the spare key, and a smooth river stone that Sophie had painted with a bright red heart. On the lid, Noah carved 4 words with his penknife for whoever might come next. That night, Ethan sat by the fire again, the flickering flames casting the shadow of the letters onto the wall. He thought of how the Carters must have felt when they left. Maybe scared, maybe hopeful, but they left something behind, he whispered, almost to the room itself, not just in words, but in spirit. He looked at the timber walls. You're more than just a roof over our heads now, aren't you? The cabin offered a soft groan in reply. Later, after the boys had fallen asleep, Ethan opened his worn notebook. His handwriting had grown steadier since the storm. He wrote, "Home isn't found. It's remembered. The ones who came before us knew that. Maybe that's why this cabin waited so long. To remind someone like me that love doesn't die when a place goes quiet. It just waits to be heard again." He closed the notebook, leaning back and letting the hearth's warmth envelop him. Outside, the night air was sharp with the scent of thawing earth and pine resin. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a fox yipped, a sharp, lonely call. But Ethan didn't feel alone. He picked up the cabin key, turning it over in his fingers. The metal was warm now, as if holding all the stories it had unlocked. When he finally lay down to sleep, the words from the letter echoed softly in his mind. This place has a heart. Keep it beating. He smiled in the dark. We will, he whispered. And the cabin, silent and watchful, seemed to breathe back. Spring arrived softly that year, washing the valley in green. Patches of wildflowers pushed through where heavy snow had lain, and the sound of running water filled the air again. The cabin breathed easier. The roof no longer leaked. The windows let in the gentle morning light. One afternoon, as Ethan and the boys worked to clear fallen branches from the path, they heard the low hum of an engine. A dusty blue pickup truck rumbled into view, pulling to a stop near the clearing. An older man climbed out, gray-bearded, broad-shouldered, with eyes that had seen their share of winters. "Afternoon," he said, raising a hand. "Heard someone was giving the old cabin a second chance." Ethan nodded, cautious. "You must be them." The man smiled. "Name's Harold. Carpenter, handyman, and the unofficial historian of these hills. Thought I'd come see for myself." Ethan invited him in, offering coffee warmed on the fire. Harold stepped inside, his eyes scanning the rebuilt walls, the mended beams, the handmade shelves. He let out a low whistle. "Did all this yourselves?" Ethan shrugged. "The boys and I learned as we went." Harold laughed, settling into a chair. "Looks better than the last time I saw it. Back then, a good gust of wind would have taken it down." Noah piped up. "Did you know the Carters, too?" "Sure did," Harold said, a faint smile on his face. "Helped old Frank Carter lay the first foundation stone when I was about your age. He used to say, 'A house doesn't stand because of the wood or the nails. It stands because someone wants it to.'" Ethan's gaze fell on the letter above the door. "It seems they still do." Harold followed his gaze and nodded, recognizing the careful fold of the paper. "So you found it, eh? Guess the letter did its job." Ethan smiled softly. "It kept our fire lit when things felt dark." The afternoon stretched into evening as they talked of wood grain, wind patterns, and the way mountain cabins needed to breathe with the weather. Harold told stories of how every home built in this valley had its quirks, how some groaned before a storm, while others whispered when the seasons changed. He stepped out and looked at the porch. "That swing's seen better days," he said. How about I make you a new one? My hands could use a good project. Ethan hesitated. You don't owe us that. Harold smiled. Don't owe you a thing, son. I owe the house. He returned 3 days later with cedar planks, rope, and a small wooden box. Together, they worked through the morning, smoothing edges, tying knots, measuring the balance. The boys helped too, proud of every nail they hammered straight. When they were finished, the swing hung from the same old oak tree, rocking gently in the mountain breeze. The cedar smelled clean and sweet. Sophie climbed on first, laughing as it carried her back and forth. Ethan watched from the steps, a knot in his throat. You didn't just build a swing, he said quietly. You gave my children back their childhood. Harold smiled, handing Ethan the small wooden box. One more thing. Inside was a handmade key, carved from maple, smooth to the touch, with a loop of twine at its end. For good luck, Harold said. Every real home needs one. Ethan turned it over in his hand, feeling the grain beneath his thumb. It wasn't metal, but somehow it felt heavier. A key that didn't unlock doors, but hearts. That night, after Harold had left, Ethan gathered the children by the fire. This one, he said, holding up the wooden key, will hang between the other two. Ben frowned in thought. What's it for? Ethan smiled. It's for tomorrow. He hung it between the rusty cabin key and the newer one Walter had given them. 3 keys, the past, the present, and what was yet to come. When the boys were in bed, Ethan sat alone outside, the stars brilliant above the ridge. He thought of how each man who had come to his door, Walter, Harold, had left something behind. Not charity, not pity, but pieces of themselves. He looked up at the sky, the Milky Way a spill of light over the dark peaks. You build a home, he whispered, and somehow it starts to build you back. The wooden key swayed gently against its sisters, tapping now and then, a quiet heartbeat, in time with the groaning of the cabin and the breathing of the forest. Before he went to bed, Ethan opened his notebook once more and wrote, There are men who build houses, and there are men who build belonging. One uses nails, the other uses time. He closed the book. The fire was embers now. The key still gleamed faintly in the glow, a promise that tomorrow, just like the cabin, would be a little stronger. By midsummer, the cabin had settled into its rhythm. Morning light streamed through the east window, catching dust motes that floated like gold flecks in water. The fire pit smoldered softly outside, and the smell of pine and roasting coffee beans filled the air. Ethan sat at the table, running his fingers over the smooth grain of the carpenter's wooden box. Harold had left it behind after installing the swing, saying, Every house needs a place to keep its days. At first, Ethan hadn't understood, but lately, he'd been filling it without even meaning to. Inside were things that didn't seem like much. A button from Noah's old jacket, a broken fishhook, a leaf Sophie had painted blue, and a rusted nail from the original porch beam. But to Ethan, each one held a story, a moment worth remembering. That morning, as he lifted the lid again, Sophie padded over, barefoot. What are you doing, Papa? She asked. Our box of days, he answered softly. Can I add something? She asked, holding out a small flat stone with a tiny hole in the middle. It's a wishing stone I found in the creek. He smiled and nodded. Then it belongs right here. She placed it gently inside, as if it were a treasure, and closed the lid with both hands. There. Now it's safe. Ben leaned in the window frame. If we keep putting things in there, we're gonna need a bigger box. Ethan laughed. Then maybe one day we'll build a chest. A real one. The idea hung in the air. Later that week, after the boys finished chopping wood, they began sketching out plans on a scrap of paper. Jagged lines, crooked corners, and wild imagination. But it was something they could build together, piece by piece. In the late afternoon, Ethan took the wooden box outside. He sat on the steps while the boys played tag near the swing. The sound of their laughter echoed through the trees, something that had been missing for so long. He turned the box over in his hands and noticed faint initials carved into the bottom. H.C. Harold Carter. Suddenly, he understood. The box wasn't made of new wood. It had been repurposed from something older, perhaps a part of the original cabin itself. The thought sent a shiver of reverence through him. It was as if the past had chosen to stay, to remind him that even in rebuilding, he wasn't starting from scratch. That night, a storm rolled in from the north. The wind howled, rain hammered the roof, and thunder boomed across the valley. Ethan got up to check the windows, while Sophie clutched her blanket, her eyes wide. "Are we safe, Papa?" He knelt beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're home," he said, "and our home keeps us safe." A loud crash tore through the air. The swing had ripped loose from its rope, slamming against the porch. Ethan ran out barefoot into the rain, dragging it inside before the wind could take it. He set it by the hearth to dry, his own clothes soaked through. Later, as the storm quieted, the children crept from their beds and joined him. The wooden box sat on the table, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Ben opened it, and they began adding pieces of the storm. A twig blown in through the door, a piece of wet rope, a wind-tossed feather. Noah whispered, "Maybe this will remind us that even storms pass." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it's for." The next morning, the sun broke through, sharp and clear. The valley was draped in mist. Harold's truck appeared once more on the ridge. He climbed out slowly, a slight limp in his step. "Came to see if the old place held," he said, looking at the cabin. "It held," Ethan replied. "She's stronger than she looks." Harold's eyes fixed on the broken swing inside the doorway. "Ah, but she took a knock." "It'll swing again," Ethan said. "We'll fix it." Harold nodded. Then he noticed the box. "Been using this?" Ethan lifted the lid. Harold leaned in, seeing the bits of memory inside. His expression softened. "Well, I'll be. That's just what Frank Carter used it for. Every season, he'd put something away. A nail, a leaf, even an old pipe he once said helped him remember what the house cost him and what it gave him back." Ethan smiled. "I guess we're carrying on the tradition." Harold reached into his pocket and placed a coin on top of the pile, an old, worn silver dollar. "Add this then, my first day's pay on this place." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin groaned softly in the wind, as if acknowledging them both. Ethan finally said, "You and Frank built the frame of this place. We're just learning how to fill it with life again." Harold nodded. "That's all a house really needs. Someone to keep breathing life into it." When Harold left, Ethan placed the coin back in the box and closed the lid. Then he whispered to himself, "Keep breathing life into it." He looked at the cabin, the swing, the forest beyond, all the small things they had built and saved. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan knew they were no longer just surviving. They were becoming. The first hint of autumn came early, in the fog that lingered longer in the mornings. The leaves turned red at the edges, and the quiet call of migrating geese cut across the gray sky. The cabin, once raw and fragile, now seemed a part of the forest itself. Smoke rose steadily from its chimney, and laughter often echoed through the trees. One crisp morning, Ethan and his sons were hauling buckets of water from the creek when Noah stopped. "Dad, look, someone's down there." Ethan straightened, squinting toward the bend where the water rushed behind the rocks. A man was half kneeling, washing something dark from his arm. He was tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes. When he looked up, his face carried the exhaustion of 1,000 hard miles. Ethan set his bucket down slowly. "Stay behind me, boys." The man raised both hands, a sign of surrender. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice hoarse. "Just passing through. Needed some water." Ethan watched him. His clothes were city clothes, not mountain clothes. "You're a long way from any road," Ethan said carefully. "I know," the man replied. "I got lost. Been walking since yesterday." Something in his tone, a desperation without deceit, softened Ethan's caution. He gestured toward the cabin. "You look half-starved. Come warm yourself." The man hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Inside, Sophie peeked out from behind the table as Ethan poured coffee. The stranger sat near the hearth, stretching his hands toward the heat. His left arm was wrapped in a stained bandage. "Name's Miles," he said finally. "Worked construction back in Bellidge. Things went south. Been on the road since." Ben, curious but cautious, asked, "Do you have any kids?" Miles shook his head. "Had someone. I guess she gave up waiting." The silence hung heavy for a moment. Then Ethan spoke. "You can rest here a while. We know what it's like to lose everything." Miles looked up sharply, as if the words had struck him deep. "You do, don't you?" Ethan nodded, meeting his gaze. "We do." For 2 days, Miles helped around the cabin. He chopped firewood, fixed a leak in the roof, and even taught Ben how to patch the sole of a torn boot using pine resin. But something about him remained distant, like a man afraid to belong anywhere. One evening, as the sun bled through the trees, Ethan noticed Miles sitting by the creek again, staring into his own reflection. The wooden box was beside him, open. Ethan approached quietly. "Looking for something?" Miles gestured to the items inside. "This. Does all this mean something to you?" "It does," Ethan said. "Every piece is a part of how we got here." Miles picked up the silver coin Harold had left. "Someone helped you too." Ethan nodded. "No one makes it alone." Miles was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've done things I'm not proud of. Walked away from people who cared. Figured if I kept moving, I'd start to feel like a ghost." Ethan sat beside him. "Ghosts don't fade when they run. They fade when someone forgives them, even if that someone is themselves." Miles stared at the water. "You think a man like me can start over?" Ethan glanced back at the cabin, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. "I think every sunrise says we can." The next morning, Miles was gone. His sleeping roll was empty. But on the table, tucked inside the wooden box, was something new. A torn photograph, folded neatly. It showed a younger Miles with a woman and a little boy smiling on a city street. On the back, in a trembling hand, were 6 words. "Tell your kids," I said, "thank you." Ethan ran his fingers over the creased edges, then placed the photo carefully among their other treasures. He didn't tell the children everything, only that Miles needed to keep walking. But they understood. Sophie asked softly, "Will he find a home someday?" Ethan looked out at the forest. Maybe he's already started. That night, after the children were asleep, Ethan sat by the fire with the wooden box in his lap. The cabin creaked gently around him, and the wind carried the faint sound of the creek below. He thought of Miles, of how every person they'd met seemed to bring something unfinished to their door, and how, in some quiet way, the cabin healed them all. He added one more item to the box, a smooth, cool gray stone from the creek. Onto its surface he carved a single word with his knife: forgiven. When he placed it inside, the box felt heavier, not with weight, but with meaning, and for the first time, Ethan realized that what they had built wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary for second chances. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the flue. Outside, the forest settled back into its watch, holding their story as it always had, silently, faithfully, endlessly. The first snow came early that year, thin as ash and cold as truth. By mid-December, the hills were hushed under a blanket of white, and the creek that once sang beside the cabin was frozen mid-song. Ethan stood in the doorway one morning, watching his breath cloud the air. "This winter has teeth," he murmured. Inside, the children huddled near the stove. Ben stirred the oatmeal with a slow, deliberate motion, and Sophie clutched her worn-out doll. The cabin, though sturdy, groaned against the storm's relentless push. The wind found every chink and crack Ethan had yet to seal. For the first time in months, he felt something he had fought hard to bury: fear. The food was running low. The woodpile dwindled faster than he'd planned, and the small town below, buried under miles of snow, had gone quiet. Even the kindness of neighbors couldn't reach this far in weather like this. Ethan spent his days clearing paths, keeping the roof clear, and mending drafts. Every night, he would look at the wooden box on the shelf. It seemed fuller now, not just in weight, but in memory. Miles's photograph rested on top, beside the silver coin, the first hammered nail, and the small wooden bird Sophie had carved in the spring. Each piece told him why he couldn't give up. Still, the cold had a way of talking, whispering doubts in the long hours of the night. One evening, as the wind howled fiercely enough to rattle the shutters, the fire burned low. Ethan leaned in to feed it, only to see the last of the wood stacked in the corner. An armful, maybe 2. Ben saw the worry behind his father's calm face. "Dad," he said quietly, "we'll be all right. I'll help you chop more tomorrow." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Tomorrow, son. The axe will freeze before it swings. We'll wait for a break in the wind." Sophie stirred under her blanket. "Are we going to be cold, Papa?" Ethan reached over and tucked her in tighter. "Not if we stick together. That's a kind of warmth, too." They huddled under the quilts, the 3 of them drawn close around the embers' faint glow. Outside, the wind shrieked like something wild. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of heartbeats and shallow breaths. Sometime after midnight, a faint scratching sound came from the door. Ben sat up, startled. "Dad, what was that?" Ethan held up a hand. The sound came again, a weak, uneven scrape followed by a soft thud. Slowly he got up, took the lantern from the table and eased the door open. A dog, half buried in a snowdrift, its ribs showing through its thin coat, staggered forward and collapsed at his feet. Ethan was on his knees instantly, scooping the exhausted creature into his arms. "Easy there, boy," he whispered. Ben and Sophie made room by the fire while he fetched an old towel. They dried the dog, wrapping it in blankets. It was hours before its shivering subsided. When it finally lifted its head, its eyes, cloudy but gentle, met Ethan's. Sophie smiled softly. "Can we keep him?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "If he wants to stay, we'll call him Rusty." The days bled together. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Ethan rationed what food they had, slipping his own portions to the dog when the children weren't looking. Rusty, in turn, stood guard by the door, his ears tuned to every sound beyond the walls. One morning, as the dawn struggled to break through the gray clouds, Rusty began to bark, sharp and insistent. Ethan stepped outside and saw it, a faint trail of smoke rising from the ridge beyond the creek. Someone else was out there. Leaving Ben in charge, Ethan followed the frozen creek, his breath pluming in the air. After an hour of trudging through waist-deep snow, he found the source, a broken-down truck, half entombed in ice. The driver was slumped inside. The man was still alive, but just barely. Ethan pried the door open and hauled him out, wrapping him in his own coat. Back at the cabin, the children worked without question. They heated water, made a place by the hearth, and waited. The man, a local delivery driver, eventually came to. His name was Gary. He'd been stranded after the mountain pass was closed, surviving 3 days on melted snow. When he realized where he was, he whispered, "Didn't think anyone lived up here." Ethan smiled faintly. "Most people don't." For 2 weeks, Gary recovered. In return for their kindness, he shared his last provisions and promised to send help as soon as the roads were clear. When the thaw finally came, Gary was true to his word. A truck arrived, loaded with blankets, canned goods, and firewood, all gifts from the townspeople who had once forgotten Ethan Ward. That night, Ethan placed Rusty's old, frayed collar inside the wooden box. The dog, strong again now, lay contentedly by the fire. The collar would remind them all that sometimes salvation scratches at your door when you least expect it. In the firelight, Ethan looked at his children and whispered, "We've been through worse, haven't we?" Ben nodded, sleepy. "I guess winter never lasts forever." Ethan smiled, his voice low and certain. "No. It just teaches us to hold on tighter until spring." Spring came late that year. The mountain thawed slowly, as if reluctant to give up its long-held silence. The creek swelled with cold, clear water, and the air smelled of pine sap and earth. The cabin groaned less in the wind now, its logs settled and seasoned. Ethan began rebuilding the porch, hammering with the same steady rhythm that had come to define his life here. One afternoon, Sophie and Ben were playing near the creek bank when she cried out, "Papa, there's something in the snow!" Ethan turned. Sophie was holding a small package wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine. It had been half buried, as if the mountain had kept it safe for them. He took it gently and brushed away the ice. Inside was a letter, folded and sealed with a faded stamp. The ink was blurred but still legible. On the front were the words, "To whoever finds this cabin." Ethan held his breath. He beckoned the children closer. He unfolded the letter, the paper fragile with age. The handwriting was steady, elegant, and unmistakably old. December 18th, 1949. If you are reading this, then you have found the place my husband and I called home. The Carter cabin was built in 1923 by hands that loved more than they knew how to say. We raised our children here, weathering winters that nearly broke us and summers that healed us. When my husband passed, the house grew too quiet. I walked away one morning and never came back. But before I left, I promised him that whoever found this cabin would find more than shelter. They would find what we found here, a reason to keep going. If you are here, I believe you needed it as much as we did. Take care of this house. Let it take care of you. In faith, Martha Carter. Sophie's eyes were wide. Papa, she wrote it for us. Ethan smiled softly. Maybe not for us exactly, but maybe for someone like us. Someone who needed to start over. Ben ran his thumb along the paper's edge. So this place has been saving people for a long time. Ethan looked around at the cabin. The patched walls, the window panes that caught the afternoon light like a promise, and nodded. It seemed so. He sat for a moment, staring at the letter, then reached for the wooden box. The old nails groaned as he lifted the lid. Inside lay their story, fragments of hardship, kindness, and quiet triumphs. This belongs here, he said, placing the letter gently among the keepsakes. It's part of the story now. Sophie leaned close, whispering. She said we'd find a reason to keep going. What's ours, Papa? Ethan's smile was slow and thoughtful. Ours is right here. You, me, and your brother, making sure this place keeps breathing. The next morning, Ethan decided to go to town for supplies. The snow had melted to mud, and patches of new grass pushed through. As he walked down the hill, he carried the memory of the letter like a quiet warmth in his chest. At the general store, the townspeople greeted him differently now, not with pity or curiosity, but with respect. A farmer named Lewis clapped him on the shoulder. Heard you made something real of the old Carter place again, he said. About time someone did. Ethan chuckled. I just fixed what was broken. Lewis smiled. That's how the world gets better, one fix at a time. On his way home, Ethan stopped at the post office. He bought a single sheet of paper and an envelope. That night, after the children were asleep, he sat by the fire and began to write. April 12th, 2023. To whoever finds this cabin. You do not know us, but we have sat by this same hearth, and perhaps you do too. My name is Ethan Ward, and this house saved me and my 3 children when the world had forgotten our names. If you are reading this, I want you to know one simple thing. You are not alone. Whatever brought you here does not define you. What you build after does. Take care of this place. It knows how to welcome the broken. And when you leave a sign that you lived, so the next soul knows someone cared before them. He folded the letter and sealed it with wax, just as Martha Carter had done 74 years before. Then, by the moonlight, he went outside and buried it beneath the porch, under the first daffodil pushing through the thaw. When he came back inside, Sophie stirred in her sleep, smiling. The firelight danced across the wooden box on the mantel. Ethan sat beside it for a long time, thinking of the chain of lives connected by a single roof, families who never met, yet shared the same heartbeat across time. He whispered into the quiet, "We are all guardians of something that outlives us." The wind sighed outside as if in answer. A year passed. The mountains no longer felt like strangers. The cabin's roof gleamed under the sun, and the garden pulsed with green. Laughter, once a foreign sound, now mingled with the whisper of the pines. Ethan sat on the porch one afternoon, sharpening a hand axe. He noticed how the silence felt different now, not empty, but full. Noah was stacking logs by the shed, his back stronger, his steps sure. Ben worked beside him, steady and patient, the same boy who once cried when his nails bent. Sophie hummed a quiet tune as she watered the wildflowers growing along the path. Even Rusty, the dog they had rescued, lay under the porch in lazy contentment. Ethan leaned back, letting the sun warm his face. A year ago they had arrived with nothing but hunger and fear. Now, their life had a rhythm, not of ease but of meaning. Later that day, a rumble echoed through the valley. Not thunder, but the crunch of tires on gravel. A truck appeared between the trees, its blue paint faded but familiar. It stopped just past the clearing, and out climbed Harold, the old farmer who had first helped them. "Well, look at that," Harold said, ambling over. "Didn't think I'd ever see the old Carter place looking this good." Ethan smiled, extending a hand. "She held up better than we did." Harold chuckled. "I'd say you two rebuilt each other." He held out a small paper sack. "Fresh peaches. My wife says every house needs a little sweetness now and then." Ethan took it gratefully. "She's right about that." The two men sat on the porch for a while, sharing the quiet company of those who have seen hard years. "Funny," Harold said at last, looking out at the hills. "How life turns. This cabin's seen more heartbreak and healing than most churches." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe that's because it doesn't ask for anything. It just stands, waiting for the next soul who needs it." Harold smiled. "Then you've given it what it needed, too." That evening, Ethan found Sophie sitting by the wooden box, tracing the letters on one of the envelopes inside. "Who's Martha Carter?" she asked softly. "She was the woman who lived here a long, long time before us," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. "She left a note for whoever came next. I guess that turned out to be us." "Do you think she can see us?" Sophie wondered. Ethan looked toward the window, where the last of the daylight spilled across the floor. "Maybe not in the way we think," he said gently. "But sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I like to believe she knows this place is loved again." Sophie smiled, content with the answer, and leaned against him. "Then we're part of her story too." "Yes, sweet girl," Ethan said. "And one day, someone might be part of ours." The news of the cabin and the family who had brought it back to life spread through the nearby towns. A small team of volunteers arrived to help restore the forest trail and preserve the cabin as a local landmark. They approached Ethan with warmth and respect, not charity. He hesitated at first. The cabin had always felt private, sacred even. But when he saw his children laughing with the newcomers, showing them how they'd fixed the windows and rebuilt the porch, he understood. This wasn't about ownership. It was about legacy. In the weeks that followed, people came and went. Historians, craftspeople, hikers. Each left something small behind. A note, a trinket, a story. The wooden box on the mantel grew heavier, its surface now bearing the fingerprints of strangers who had become kin through gratitude. One late afternoon, a woman named Elise arrived with a photograph. "I think you should have this," she said. The picture showed a young couple, the Carters, standing before the same cabin nearly a century ago, surrounded by spring blossoms. On the back, in Martha's faded script, it read, "Where faith outlasts failure." Ethan framed it and hung it above the hearth. That night, as the fire crackled and his children slept nearby, he stared at it for a long time. He saw not ghosts, but guardians, reminders that each generation leaves a little light for the next to follow. He opened the wooden box one more time and placed another item inside. A small, smooth stone from the creek, newly carved with a single word, "Continue." Then he closed the lid and whispered, "We will." Outside, the fireflies began to rise from the grass, their slow, pulsing rhythm like the steady heartbeat of the mountain. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Ward felt not like a man who had lost everything, but like one who had been chosen to remember. The morning sky was the color of steel when Ethan, doing repairs on the porch, pried up a loose floorboard. He had seen it sag for weeks and decided it was time to fix it. As he worked the wood free, his fingers brushed against something buried in the cool, dark earth beneath. Curious, he dug gently until he touched paper. It was a letter, yellowed and tightly folded. The edges were brittle, the ink faded, but still legible. He unfolded it with care. The script was old-fashioned and elegant. To whoever finds this, if you are reading it, it means the cabin has lived another life beyond my own. I built this home with my own hands for a woman I loved, and for the child we lost too soon. I leave this place not as a ruin, but as a promise, that even in loneliness, love can build something that lasts. Please let the walls hear laughter again. Let smoke rise from the chimney. Let this house live. Samuel Carter, 1949. Ethan caught his breath. Carter. The name carved above the doorframe. The family who had first called this place home. He sat back, stunned. "Kids," he called, his voice thick. "Come here." They gathered around, wide-eyed, as he read the letter aloud. When he finished, the room was silent, but for the soft crackle of the fire. For a moment, it felt as if Samuel Carter himself was there, listening. Ben broke the silence. "So this was his place?" Ethan nodded slowly. "His, and now ours. He left it behind so it could keep on living." Sophie leaned closer, touching the letter with a small hand. He wanted it to be happy again. Ethan smiled through a tightness in his throat. "I think it finally is." That night, he placed the letter inside the wooden box beside their own. The lid groaned softly as he closed it, sealing the past and present together. The next morning, he gathered his children on the porch. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp soil. "We're going to finish what Mr. Carter started," he said. Ben frowned. "You mean rebuild?" Ethan nodded. "All of it. Not just for us, for everyone who believed this place could live again." And so they worked. Day after day, the sound of hammers echoed through the valley. Neighbors returned, bringing supplies, new boards, nails, cans of paint. Harold came back with his truck full of tools, and Mrs. Keller brought pies to keep their spirits up. By the end of the week, the cabin no longer looked haunted. It looked alive, not perfect, but whole. They painted the door red, the same shade Carter had described in a forgotten journal entry they found with the letter. Above it, Ethan carved one more line beneath the old name. Carter Ward Home, 2023. It was a bridge between generations, two families separated by decades, bound by faith and fire. That night, they lit the hearth once more. Sophie climbed into Ethan's lap, and Noah handed him the wooden box. "Keep it safe, Dad," he said. Ethan smiled. "Always." He opened the box, placed Carter's letter on top, and closed the lid. It now held two intertwined stories, one from the past, another still being written. And somewhere, out beyond the forest, as dusk deepened into a tapestry of stars, Ethan felt the weight of both lives, Carter's and his own, merging into something timeless. The cabin had survived. So had they. And maybe, in some quiet way, that was the miracle Carter had always hoped for. The first snow of the new winter came silently, blanketing the valley in a hush. Inside, the cabin glowed with life. The hearth burned warm, and the scent of pine mingled with the sweet aroma of Sophie's bread cooling on the table. Ben stacked firewood by the door, while Noah repaired a latch he'd made months before. Ethan stood by the window, a mug in his hand, watching the world he had once feared losing. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a story, stitched together with love. "Dad," Noah said from the doorway, breaking his reverie, "you should sit. You've been on your feet since morning." Ethan chuckled softly. "Getting old, I guess." He settled into the chair by the fire, the one Sophie had painted blue because, she said, it was the color of peace. Ben joined them, his hands calloused but steady. "Finished with the logs. Should last us through the cold." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "You've all done more than I ever dreamed." Sophie skipped over, holding something behind her back. "Close your eyes, Papa." He obliged, amused. When he opened them, she placed a small carving in his hand. A wooden heart. Its edges uneven but beautiful. "I made it from the last piece of the broken floorboard," she said shyly, "so you always remember where we started." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Sweetheart, I could never forget." He placed the small heart inside the wooden box, next to Carter's letter and their own. Later that night, the townspeople gathered at the cabin. It had become a tradition, a community meal each winter to celebrate what they now called Cabin Day. Laughter filled the air, along with the steam from bowls of stew and the sound of a fiddle. Harold raised a mug. "To the Wards," he said, his voice ringing with warmth, "who taught us all what a home really means." Ethan smiled, humbled. "To home," he answered softly, his gaze falling on his children, on the glowing hearth, and on the wooden box that held their story. "To home, and to the hands that keep it standing." The joy that followed warmed the night, more than the flames ever could. When the crowd had departed and the laughter faded into the forest, the family remained by the hearth. Sophie leaned against her father's shoulder. "It's so quiet again," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "The quiet is good. It means the world is resting." Noah stared into the fire. "What will we do next year, Father?" A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "Whatever comes our way. This place isn't finished. It's just beginning." The next morning, the snow had stopped. A thin mist hung over the valley as sunlight streamed through the trees. Ethan stepped outside, his boots sinking into the snow. He gazed toward the horizon, where the old forest road vanished between the pines. Behind him, the cabin stood proud, smoke rising steadily from its chimney, a sign of life in the frozen stillness. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket and touched the cabin key. It was the same one he had found buried beneath the porch months ago, now worn smooth with use. "Thank you," he whispered again. Not just to Carter, but to the life that had brought him here. He turned to see his children at the window, their faces radiant as they waved, the kind of joy that can only be earned through struggle. In that moment, Ethan understood something deeper than survival. It wasn't the cabin that had saved them. It was who they had become while rebuilding it.